Okay, welcome to the Illegitimate Scholar podcast, the podcast where we assert our right to share our unsolicited opinions on culture, history, social studies, and human nature. This is episode 9, and I am Sam. And today we're going to be talking about ethics and culture and how they relate, and I'm going to be making a number of different points related to that. Going off of the central question, there's a second central question, but it's a secret that I'm not going to tell you until later. How are ethical codes reflective of the culture that produces them, and vice versa? Because this is kind of a chicken and the egg type situation. And this will make more sense later once I start talking about this. But it's either ethical codes are created by the culture, or the culture creates the ethical codes. And really, it's a little bit of both. But basically, the things that people do in society become what's acceptable. And people do some really bad stuff in history. And when I say history, humans have been around for a long time. Anatomically modern humans, like Homo sapiens, have been around for a few hundred years. That covers all of history. When I say history, I'm talking about like the last 12,000 years that historians call history. Before that, it's prehistory, but most of that is also... not most of that, but the last couple hundred, or I think the number now is 300,000, but it used to be like 60,000 that we knew about anatomically modern humans. But archaeologists recently found a 300,000-year-old anatomically modern human. So we're at least that old. And when I say we, I mean like our species in the form that it is today. Because once you start going back far enough, if you believe in evolution, you're going to find like that humans start to look more like our ape brethren. Other apes, we are apes, but start to look hairier, and then they start to get even smaller, and eventually you get to something that looks like a lemur, and after that it gets really weird. So like obviously we weren't lemurs, but gradual changes over time. Well, our ancestors were lemurs-ish, but over time, very gradually, things changed. But there have been no scientifically significant changes in 300,000 years. So hypothetically, a person from today could, as a baby, be dropped into that environment, and they'd probably die because most babies died back then. But if they survive, they can grow up as an anatomically modern human. That they'll grow up, but they'll have the culture of this pre-Stone Age or like early Stone Age people, and they'll be very different. They'll be very, very different. And they could, in theory, survive, and they could reproduce with those people because those were anatomically modern humans. So we've been the same for a long time. And people in different places do very, very different things. But even though they have very different ways of life, like I like to watch football games, and Stone Age people liked to beat each other on the head, and they had no concept of consent that we know of. I mean, maybe they did, but I kind of doubt it. So those are different people that their environment shaped how they thought about the world, their ideas of morality and ethics, and we're going to talk a lot about things like that today. But the point is that all of these different traits that you find in humans, these are cultural traits that we're looking at. I mean, there's some mild genetic differences, but people are largely the same. People are largely the same in a genetic sense. And what that means is that we're pretty sure that people, and even if there were immutable traits, it wouldn't be allowed to be talked about between different races. Like it would just be completely taboo in our society, because that's one thing in our society that we couldn't talk about that. But I truly don't believe that there are differences in different races of people that will lead them to act drastically differently. Maybe some minor things, like obviously people have different skin colors, so there are slight things that are immutable, that are genetic, that teach people, or that can affect the way that people live their lives. Like, for example, Black people in America had trouble getting more vitamin D because of the amount of melanin, whereas white people have an easier time getting vitamin D. They also have an easier time getting skin cancer, which is the other side of that coin. So there was, because there was a comorbidity of COVID, where people with vitamin D deficiency were more likely to die. More black people died as a result of that, and other things. So there are immutable characteristics like that, but most of the characteristics, and this is pretty obvious if you think about it for a moment, how different people were 1,000 years ago. Like, I'm genetically mostly Celtic, which would mean that I would, if it were true that genetics made you so much different, then I would be genetically predisposed to paint my skin and run around the woods. But nobody's doing that in Ireland right now, even. That they're unfortunately been very, like, mostly everybody speaks English, and the people that aren't speaking. There's probably more Polish speakers in Ireland than there are fluent Irish language speakers. So the point is that the differences between people across the globe, across cultures, it's cultural. It's not genetic. There aren't immutable characteristics that, well, there are for how human beings act, but there aren't these huge differences between races of people that makes them act a certain way. There's a lot of things within humans that makes humans act a certain way, but that's humans in general. We have a different nature than a kangaroo, and that's because of our different genetic code. But, Americans don't have a different DNA code. And, this is hard because America is not a race, but we'll say white people don't have a different DNA code than Asian people. The differences between the United States and China and all of our different cultures that we have here aren't based on the DNA of the Chinese. They're based on the culture of the Chinese. And when I say culture here, I'm talking about the ideology of the CCP. I'm not that's a part of culture. I'm not saying that America has an issue with Confucianism. I'm talking about the government and how our powers are diametrically opposed. And in certain situations, honestly, China used to be a friend of America at certain points. And even the early communists early Chinese communists were friendly to America, but that didn't work out too well because we were supporting the nationalists against the Chinese. But I digress. So the difference is culture. Long-winded way of saying the difference is culture. And if you get me talking about the Chinese, I'm just going to keep talking about the Chinese because I love Chinese culture. So the morality of a culture is formed around their way of living and the reverse. So, okay, I need to go get printer ink after that. So values are taught by the culture, and ideally the culture is going to promote positive traits, right? So like the culture is going to promote traits to perpetuate itself, like when those traits serve the community well. So there's a ton of examples for this. I'm going to talk about a few specific ones, but I'm going to talk about a few in just a minute. So this is reflected in cultural stories and institutions that are formed, all these different things that are formed in different cultures. So it's not just like, I'm not just talking about values like, we value patriotism and hard work. I'm talking about the culture. Every aspect of the culture is framed around the values and beliefs that push that culture on and perpetuate that culture. And these are always changing, but cultures that are persistent over time, they have ways of mending their political system, making it malleable so that it survives over generations. So the ancient Chinese, I'm right back to talking about the Chinese, but this one's actually written down on the page, so it counts a little bit better. In ancient China, and I shouldn't just say ancient China because, like, I'm talking about dynastic China. So up until, like, the civil wars of the 19th century in China, and we'll get into China plenty later, but traditional dynastic China, and this changed over time, but one of the things that they really highly valued was bureaucracy. So there were these bureaucratic tests for Chinese people. And these would allow people to go into the bureaucracy. And this was a high-paid, high-valued positions. So this was something that people really wanted, and what this did was it incentivized the skills that were related to bureaucracy. And this meant that China produced a really good bureaucracy, and this was a huge part of their success as an empire. And people, they fucking sleep on bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is at its most, the most benevolent way I can describe it. It's the basis of organization for something that couldn't be organized organically. So these methods of creating bureaucrats and the hopefully generally positive actions of bureaucrats that are, known to be corrupt, they, at least some of them, I'm not saying all bureaucrats are saying being corrupt. I'm saying that it's very easy for them to be corrupt. So there's a possibility for corruption to destroy the system. But if you can devise a system of bureaucracy that punishes corruption and so creates, and you promote the traits that create honest bureaucrats, and you create a good bureaucracy that's supported by a bunch of militaries, and you have good distribution that keeps people fed and makes people more prosperous, that's the way that an empire can sustain itself over a long time. And China is the OG empire. Like, Rome ain't shit, man. Like, China was just as great as Rome, if not greater, at the time when Rome was at its height. And it's older than Rome, the Roman Empire at least, and the Roman Republic. It's older than Rome, and it survived way after. I mean, it survived 1,500 years, even dynastic China, and it's still together today in a different form, not dynastic, but it's connected. You can't say that about the Roman Empire, even though the Turks like to claim it, but it's just not true. Not in their wildest dreams. But China, you got to do the hand thing. They used that high bureaucracy. They promoted this in their culture, and it was very successful. And that meant that they were able to take over other countries. And their culture was so influential that the nations that survived around it, like a lot of countries, were just taken over. Some of that's still going on today in Tibet, and the Chinese call Xinjiang, but the local people would call East Turkestan. But the countries that survived were the ones that adopted Confucian thought and based their society around this. And that was true in Japan and Korea as well. They were, I mean, I'm not going to say entirely because that's just not true, but they at least adopted certain traits in of the Confucian bureaucracy, and they incorporated those into their other cultural traits that in a way that was acceptable to the people, and they created prosperous countries that are even powerful still today. So another example, the Vikings. Okay, I'm going to say Vikings. And the Vikings are largely misunderstood in history, but I don't care. This isn't really a history show. So the Vikings promoted bravery and fierceness. The Vikings are going around everywhere fighting people, and they're killing people and taking over, and their culture promoted bravery and fierceness. It promoted these traits that helped the Vikings to perpetuate their culture and make more people and get more rich. So, and this is down to all of it. The stories of these great warriors, Beowulf, and there are stories of trickery, and if you watch the Vikings show, some of that stuff was based on real Viking stories. When the Vikings, the guy hid in the coffin and then popped out, and they all grabbed their axes and murdered an entire church. And I don't know if it actually happened, but it's a story that they told in order to these stories were formed around how the Vikings made their living. And while they started as traders, what clearly happened is that people found that raiding was much more successful. And when the people in an area find that one thing makes them more successful, success in this case I'm defining as what gets you more resources, more influence, and more people so that you grow as a culture, the culture expands. And eventually, Denmark becomes a very powerful kingdom. But these individual tribes, and they were this culture of promoting warriors and fiercity, and even having an afterlife that was based on you dying in battle. All of these things are related to promoting the most brave, strong men that are great at fighting, and women, I think, because I think the Vikings did have a lot of women that fought, which is another reflection of how centered around raiding these people were, right? That they also incorporated women where a lot of other cultures didn't, or did it in a very, very small way, or not or a different way, really. They only incorporated a few into their actual fighting force. But women are always helping for wars. They always have been. When a war is going on, women have always been doing an insane amount of work. I don't want to get off on a tangent about that, but they might not be the frontline soldiers, but they were helping a lot, and they were doing the logistics a lot of the times, which we'll discuss more later. But logistics is very important, and that's why Russia can't take over Ukraine. Okay, so this culture that the Vikings have, it revolves around taking over. It revolves around having really good fighters. It revolves around it being okay to go to other places and take their shit, right? So like, it's cool. It's good in our culture that we're us, and there's other people, and they don't think like us, and they're dumb, and they put all their rich goldy shit in these buildings that have like old weak men that spend all their time just taking feathers and writing shit down. And we're going to go in there, we're going to kill a bunch of people, and we're going to take stuff. And eventually that turns into this massive thing where the Vikings are settling in northern France, and they're becoming feudal lords, and they have all these serfs there to work the land for them, and they can expand even more. They basically take over England. Well, I mean, the Vikings directly basically took over England, but then while the Anglo-Saxons kind of fought back, they revived their culture based on the situation, and that's actually a incredible story, and really is related to a few of the things I've talked about, but I don't have time. So the Vikings basically took over most of England. England fought back, but then Normans, they were Vikings. I mean, they might have been a few generations removed, but they were Vikings. They were Vikings culturally. They invade and they take over England. And they also took over, like, the Varangian Guard was in Eastern Rome. Like, he was in the Eastern Roman Emperor's court fighting for him. They took over islands in the Mediterranean. They went everywhere. They were incredible. And this was because of the concentration they had in their culture on fighting, and how rich it made them, and how it allowed them to expand. And their culture was formed around the idea that it's okay to go to these places and take their shit. And a lot of cultures say that, and they might say that they won't, but a lot of cultures enrich themselves off of attacking other people in a way that is deemed acceptable by their culture. And if something, I'll say that in a little bit. Okay, so the Imperial Japanese in World War II. Talk about batshit insane. Like, them and the Nazis in World War II. Like, it's crazy what these people thought was okay. The sex slavery in the Imperial Japanese in World War II. This culture was, the Imperial Japanese, they used an old Bushido code, the samurai code. And they kind of bastardized it a little bit to fit their culture better, their modern culture. But they used that to produce the values in their people that would allow them to fight against the Western powers in Europe. And they did it very successfully. But that type of extreme change and fanaticism comes along with a lot of other extreme things. And what that meant was, these horrible experiments, Unit 731, and the killing of millions of civilians, like literal, in the newspaper, like, you hear about atrocities committed by all sides in war. Every country commits atrocities in war. It's an inevitability, and it's one of the reasons why we shouldn't go to war. But in a Japanese newspaper published to the public, and I think I should verify this, but I'm not going to stop right now to do that. They were publishing like an article literally about Japanese soldiers bayoneting people, and there were pictures of Japanese bayoneting babies. And there were two officers that had a contest for the amount of people that they could kill with a katana, I think, and they were publishing that in a newspaper, in their own newspaper. Like, these are things that they thought was okay. They thought that conquered people, and that included individual surrendered soldiers, were not worthy of life or respect. And that's why so many Japanese, English and American, Australian soldiers, Marines sailors died in the hands of the Japanese, because they didn't really respect the laws of war that were created by Europeans, which, I don't know. That's their own idea. I think killing people is bad, and I think killing surrendered soldiers is bad, but, I'm from the West. That's what we think here. So, most of the time, not everybody, obviously. But they thought that it was acceptable to kill surrendered enemies, and a lot of other people have too. In fact, in certain situations, it is acceptable to kill surrendered enemies, at least when I'm thinking about like 19th century war, 18th century war. For most of human history, in most places, if a city or a town or a garrison was attacked, then the commander of the post would have the chance to surrender. And if they refused the chance to surrender, and whatever it is was taken over, then it was considered acceptable for there to be no quarter, no prisoners taken, because an assault of a armored location, like a place with walls, is very costly in men to the attackers. So a lot of people die. So basically, that disincentivizes people defending the garrison if they're being attacked by an overwhelming force. Because they know, like, well, we're going to lose, better surrender now so we don't all get killed. And it incentivizes people to surrender on the attacker side if there is a culture of them being treated with respect and not killed, at least. A lot of times they would just be enslaved. Just enslaved, right? So the Japanese culture in World War II revolved around this being acceptable. The same thing in any other place that was committing an atrocity. But all of these things that I talked about, like, we would consider them very bad. Like, it's not good in our society to be, maybe it was 150 years ago, to be the big strong dude who's going in and physically killing people with a sword and taking their shit. Like, people don't take kindly to that type of thing, and they shouldn't, because we live in a society. Where the hell was I? At the bottom of the page. But in these cultures where this stuff was happening, it was made to be acceptable. And for whatever reason, it worked for them for a time, at least. But obviously, all of these things are not okay. It's not okay to, bayonet babies, kill them with katanas. It's not okay to run into other places and kill their religious leaders and take their gold. It's not okay to sacrifice enemy soldiers alive and rip their hearts out and throw them on fires and shit, like the Aztecs were out of their goddamn minds. And it's not okay to, as a European country, to run up in other places and kill all of them and enslave the people that are there, and then, go get more slaves from another place. Like, that's not cool either. But at certain times, all of these things were considered acceptable by the culture that was in them. No, like the culture that accepted these things. At one point, these things were deemed acceptable. And we have certain things in our culture that are deemed acceptable. So those first three examples were from like a very, very different places in the past. And I actually have had a few listeners from China, not China. Well, yes, China, but China and Japan, and I think a couple from Scandinavia as well. But I'm going to do some closer examples now, a little bit quicker than the last ones, I hope. But I'm going to look at, actually, I already talked about slavery everywhere, but I'm going to talk about slavery more in the context of the U.S. and a few other things as well. The things that are closer to Western countries today. So slavery starts existing basically when people settle down into cities, or even like pre-cities, like smaller settlements. Whenever there's people that become sedentary, they were oftentimes just enslaving the hunter-gatherers that were around them. And eventually this morphs into more cities, and these cities are attacking each other. And if they take over a city, they're probably going to take everybody as slaves there, and they're going to sell them because it's very profitable to sell people. So basically what I think very simply happened is that people who were enslaving other people were making enough money for them to be the people that were in charge. And anybody who wasn't slaving other people, they objected to it somehow. Well, they're probably just going to be gone eventually. So everyone's like the Roman Empire used slavery. So it's possible that the Roman Empire helped the Roman Empire, that slavery helped the Roman Empire to grow. So if slavery helped the Roman Empire to grow, then, since they're growing and other people don't have slaves, they're going to take over those people without slaves. And that's kind of what happened, because there's slavery in Rome, there's slavery in China, there's slavery in all of these, all of the civilizations before that, the Indus River Valley, the Mesopotamian River Valley, the Nile. There's slavery in all of these places, and including a lot of cultures in the Americas as well. So it's even acceptable in the United States until the mid 1800s, and people like to blame the South for this, but slavery was, if you count the colonial era, slavery was there for most of our history up until that point. Slavery was happening in the North, but it wasn't happening to the same degree with the plantations, and that was why it was able to be gotten rid of in New England and the Northeast very quickly. Not very quickly, it probably should have been quicker, but that's why it was able to be ended without a war, because in the South, it basically was so intertwined with the political and economic system that people had formed they formed their opinions based on it. They had to think it was acceptable to do these things, just like the Vikings did, just like the Imperial Japanese did, because that's how their culture perpetuated itself. They made it okay. They found reasons to justify what they did, and that allowed it to get worse, and vice versa. Like the culture fed into the actions, and then the actions fed into the culture. So they had slaves. They had to think it was okay to have slaves, so they justified it. All aspects of politics goes into justifying it. Religion was used to justify it. University stuff was used. Research by university professors was used to justify it. And that justified it for the culture, and it allowed it to perpetuate. And that this isn't just the South, because in the North, while there is gradual abolition after the American Revolution in these places, they either end it. Some states end it immediately. After the American Revolution, other states, they do a gradual abolition where they free, like no new slaves. Any person born is free. And then the enslaved people that are still enslaved when it was either the Constitution or the Revolutionary War, it worked differently in different places. But they freed them over time, and by the Civil War, there are no slaves in the North, in theory. However, in the colonial period and a little bit after that, prior to the banning of the slave trade, a lot of the people in New England were making a lot of money off of not having slaves next to them, but by by making money off of the trade of slaves, because it was people from New England and New York and Europeans. But in America, the people that were in the United States or pre-United States, the colonies that were trading the slaves with the people in the South, these were mostly people from New England. And that's not like, we can justify that as New Englanders, as that's not as bad as having the slaves, but is it really better? Like, you're still a huge part of it. It's a massive part of it, but New England made that okay. The culture made it okay that they were involved. And the culture even had a few slaves. Like, people knew that there were slaves. There were more legal protections in New England than there were in the South. It's a myth that all slaves didn't have any legal protection, although definitely a smaller level of legal protection. But New England was doing bad shit. They were involved in the slave trade. There's also the colonialism by mostly European powers, but also like the United States a little bit, like the Banana Wars in Latin America. And there seems to be an understanding today that these things were bad, but, there are still consequences from those. And there's also European countries used to attack other European countries like all the time and take things over. And there was more of a culture of violence between European countries. But World War I and World War II, France and the UK and a few other countries, they made out really, really well at the expense of Germany, Austria, Hungary. Even Poland didn't do too well. They got a lot of their territory taken by the Soviet Union. People don't like to talk about it, but they did. And they just, on the other end, just gave German land to Poles, which I don't know. But what I am saying is that it serves all those powers, especially those people in power in the countries that had just won a lot of land, to then be like, all right, guys, we don't do war here anymore. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen anymore. Like, it's like they were playing a basketball game, and when a team realized that they were up, they were like, all right, game over. Whoever's up wins. And they won a little bit. But at the same time, it's a good thing that there's no land wars in Europe being acceptable. Obviously, everyone's really super mad at Putin for invading Ukraine, because this was supposed to be something that didn't happen in Europe anymore. That culture of it not happening in Europe makes it so that people don't have to concentrate on defense of the country. They still do wars overseas, but there isn't anything going on in their own countries, and that's very destructive, and they don't want that. They want people to make a lot of money, and violence and instability does not allow people to make a lot of money unless you're the ones selling the war machines to the people who are destroying the things. So Putin invades Ukraine because he's like, no, wait, though, Russia has a claim on this land, and we're going to press this claim, which would have been perfectly fine for most of human history. It's no longer fine. And I'm not saying that I think that it should be fine. It's obviously wrong to invade another country, but I'm saying that as somebody raised in the West, where that's kind of the way we think. Okay, so now this brings me to my next part. So the question in the next section is, how does our own culture justify bad things done while condemning others? And that was my big secret, although I'm pretty sure I accidentally said it verbatim anyway, because I don't know how to stay on topic that well. But my perspective is that the ideas of society form to accept the bad and must be acceptable for a culture to continue. So the ideas of a society form to accept the bad. And when I say the bad, it could be anything. Like, a society could form to accept slavery. Many of them have. They could form to accept genocide of other people, dehumanization of other people, reckless conditions in other countries, the lack of safety for certain people that makes them more safe. Like, there's a huge list of things. But if something is bad for someone else that a culture can justify, it's either being a member of that culture and society that's right next to you, or anybody or somebody who is far away, and this is way easier and this is way more common in the modern world because the suffering of people far away is less familiar to us. So a justification can and will be made for that because no culture exists without doing some damage to somebody. The creation of a culture, like maybe somebody could argue that there are certain situations where this is not true, but every successful large culture in world history expands itself and perpetuates itself at the expense of somebody else. And it might be a minor thing. It probably won't be a minor thing. The Turks exist at the expense of the Armenians. That's a thing. Sorry, I'm not trying to pick on the Turks. It's just the first thing that I thought of. So the rules of society are created by the same power structure that created the culture. So, and vice versa. All this stuff is intertwined and works to legitimize the other thing. So the rules of society, they're created by a power structure that is linked with that culture. So the culture that creates, so this power structure grows organically, hopefully over time, and it has certain actions, it has certain values, and it's not going to decide. A culture that grows up on slavery is not going to then be like, well, we're not doing slaves anymore, we're going to do this new thing, unless it no longer economically serves them to have slaves. And so like in the United States, Congress is beholden to the voters and in theory and donors like today. And I'm going to get into modern day examples in just a second, just a few, but the example of like people suffering in other countries, those people don't vote for Congress, right? They're not American citizens. And back when the United States had slaves, those slaves, they're not allowed to vote. They're not considered full citizens. So they're not going to vote. Their say is not being heard. And really, then the government is going to be whoever has the influence based on the political system that is in that area. Gosh, that was a horrible way. How the hell did I fuck that up that bad? But in Congress, what it means is that, people vote. And who people vote for gets to govern. And nobody's going to win votes by not caring about the issues in America. Like sometimes they do. People vote for... no one's going to vote for somebody whose sole like campaign promise. So it gets to the bottom of the importance list is helping people overseas when there are so many poor people in their own community. People want stuff that helps them. And honestly, I'll get into the example in a minute about a few things about how certain things that might seem good helped other people. And I'm going to do a whole episode on how the stated interest of a political promise is often different from the real interest, the real reason why that happens. So examples of the modern day. There are current things going on that are very bad, but our culture justifies. So in theory, there's no slavery in the United States. Legal slavery in the United States. There's obviously human trafficking, except and this is very important, in prisons and the military. And, there's no slavery in the United States, but we still use a lot of products that are created in countries that do not have the same labor practices that we do. And so there is what we would describe, what could be described by a U.S. court as slavery going on to create products that we use. And there's direct studies on this. They're not hard to find. They're from mainstream sources. If you want to ignore this, you can, but it's going on. People don't deny this. A lot of companies were using Uyghur Muslims who are in concentration camps in China for parts of their labor. I don't think they were explicitly aware, but I don't really think they care because of what other kind of conditions. And I'm no better. I use this stuff too. I buy too many products because I'm a goddamn American. So there's just too many, there would be too much for me to search for, and it's easy to put out of my head because it's far away. But that doesn't mean that our society doesn't implicitly justify and kind of cause a lot of the suffering that happens in other countries. And our culture has formed to accept that because we have great benefit from the fruits of labor of these people in other countries, and we don't directly see it, so we're able to put it out of our brains. So in addition to that, there's the child slavery, mass poverty, extortion. These create our cheap goods, and we can push it aside, but there is a direct link between what we do as a society as a whole and what happens to other people. And there's also the fact that, people don't care about prisoners, people imprisoned in this country, but they should. They should. And I've said that. I think I said that in the last episode. Another example. The United Kingdom banned the slave trade. They did this because they benefited from having the slave trade banned. They participated in the slave trade for a long time. They only started deciding that slavery was immoral and that we shouldn't have the slave trade when the slavers and the products that slaves created were in direct competition with their brand new, totally not slavery serfdom enforced on South Asia and all these other places. So they just took the high ground. That it was bullshit. Okay, they didn't do this out of the kindness of their heart. And it's the same thing when the Union attacks the South. And they didn't do this to free the slaves. And I'm not saying that the Civil War isn't about slavery. Yeah, it was about slavery, because slavery formed the basis of a huge amount of the Southern culture. And it was economically intertwined with anything. And so the culture had made it acceptable, and they were not going to give up their slaves. But the North did not give a shit about the slaves. They just didn't. The only thing that the North cared about was that the fact that the South was a slave society, that they were in direct competition, and they wanted it to be one country because it was more prosperous. That way that they could produce way more, and war with another near country would be disastrous. It could make us look like Latin America today, with all these different countries instead of being united into just, U.S. and Mexico's right there. So the U.S., Mexico, and Canada and North America, that's kind of it. But the North didn't give a shit. The people in the Union, they just wanted to have the power over the South, and they did have a disproportionate amount of power, especially for a long time with the Reconstruction, the military occupation, and it allowed the Union the areas. The Union is now on the Confederacy at this point, but it allowed the states that were originally in the Union to enrich themselves even more. And today, that is still true. The North is richer than the South. The North won the war over the South, and they were able to kind of enforce their own will about how they wanted the country to go. So yeah, they didn't, the Union could say like, oh, we freed the slaves. Well, yeah, but you didn't give a shit. United Kingdom banned the slave trade. They didn't give a shit about the slaves. They were doing it themselves 30 years before. Same with America. Same with the United States. The Union, countries in the Union, they had slaves. A few of them still had slaves. Okay. So the War on Terror. It's another one. Really fun one, right? So hundreds of thousands of deaths happen just to civilians. The deaths for other military personnel go even higher, but there are hundreds of thousands of deaths, at least 387,000, and I think that's a low estimate, of direct casualties to civilians in the War on Terror. And this is implicitly justified by the United States. And people can say that these wars aren't going on anymore, and the height of Iraq and Afghanistan is no longer there, but there is and has been interventions in Libya, Palestine, with Israel, of course, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, all these places. And in Yemen, some people would say that there is a genocide going on, and other people, some of the same people, would say that the U.S. is supporting it implicitly and almost explicitly, as it's perpetuated directly by the Saudis. And in a lot of places, people support intervention in these places. And most of the time, this intervention comes to the point of just destabilization of a country. So, in Yemen, I don't know. We probably shouldn't support that war, but if we didn't support it, it might not be happening in the first place. But in the other places, we have this massive history of invading other countries, killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people, not just us, but the situation that's created. And this happens, and it doesn't solve anything, kills a bunch of innocent people. And, people just keep supporting the same politicians that did it. All the politicians that did this stuff, a ton of them are still in positions of power. I mean, and it's not just Republicans. If you're listening to this and you think it's Republicans that are doing this, it's both. These wars have always been bipartisan, and they still are. A lot of the justifications I see today about invading other countries is for like human rights abuses. But like there's human rights abuses all over the world, and it doesn't solve human rights abuses when you destabilize a shitty government. It just makes the situation less stable, and it'll probably allows more of those things to happen. There's just not, and I'm going to go into this in another one, but there's not a history of a stable country being created directly from the intervention of somewhere else. The intervention of a foreign power. No European nation has ever attacked somewhere, like taken it over, and then created a prosperous state from there. You can't create democracy like that. It has to be ground up. You can't impose one culture on somebody else's culture and expect them to just accept the culture that is so foreign to them that it doesn't make any sense, and they can't convince the people there to do it. Democracy only works when people believe in it, and they only believe in it when people have the cultural knowledge and the indoctrination and the teaching that comes with believing in democracy. So you can't just impose that on other people, just like you can't impose values on other people. As much as, how much of the world like hates America? Like they hate America, and people can hear that and be like, well, fuck them. Like, but they got fucking good reasons, right? And I'm not saying I love America, okay? But I also want, because I love America and I love Americans, I want to discuss the bad things that we do as a country. And talking about the bad things that we do as a country and also how we justify them is a way of culturally dealing with these really, really bad situations so that we can create a culture that doesn't support them, so that we can change the culture to not allow our government to support, to support and perpetuate foreign wars that kill so many people. And maybe we do get benefits from that, and I think that essentially in an indirect way we probably do, and we must, because the U.S. government has become the most powerful in the world, and they didn't get that way by not invading other countries. The British Empire, the largest empire in history, did not get that way by not invading other countries. But, Putin invades Ukraine. Putin invades Ukraine, and everyone's like, no, this isn't fucking cool. You can't do that. You can't invade in Europe. But we do that shit all the time in other countries. We always fucking go in and bomb civilians. It happens, like the U.S. is probably doing that right now somewhere. I don't even know where, but a few years ago, we were bombing a bunch of countries all the time. And I'm not saying that it's okay for Putin to invade Ukraine, but what I am saying is consider why you think, and if you think that it's acceptable for the U.S. to be using bombs overseas, or if you don't necessarily think that's true, maybe look at the politicians that you support. Consider how they support it, because it's Democrats and Republicans. If you voted for a Democrat or Republican, you voted for one that has explicitly supported war. Why is it not a big enough deal for you that a politician that you support is perpetuating war overseas? in a like brown country. We don't even need to phrase it that way. In another country, in a non-European country, why is that not a deal breaker for you? And the easy answer might be like, well, it's bipartisan, both parties support it. So what am I supposed to do? Like, I have to vote for one of them, and since we don't have a third party that's anti-war, that's, you know, that kind of does it. I mean, we have third parties, but they're not popular enough for people to take them seriously. And I vote in them, but I'm a fucking weirdo with a shitty podcast. So maybe that's one way. The two-party system is pretty much built to support war perpetually, since it's not a major topic that people talk about anymore. It's not really up for discussion because both sides support it. Since both sides support it, there's no culture war bullshit about it. So it just quietly gets pushed aside to the point where we're just bombing Muslim people and other people, but a lot of Muslim people. We have been for like 25 years. And a lot of them don't like us. Some of them do. A lot of them don't. And I don't fucking blame them, because I'd be pretty pissed off if someone was bombing me. I don't like that shit. I wouldn't want to get bombed. And if you're finding some way to justify it, I'm going to have another episode on the difference of stated interest versus the real interest of somebody in a lot of different situations. But like, if you're somebody that supports intervention overseas, and a lot of people do, a lot of Democrats, a lot of like neocon type Republicans do, just out of like, you know, we're America, we're the best, we have to project power, we have to stop the communists and the terrorists from coming in. It's like a George W. Bush, Alex Jones, not a good one. We have to stop the terrorists from coming in and taking our freedom and our jobs. And so there's like plenty of ways to justify this. Like the conservative way to justify it and the liberal way to justify it is like that a lot of these countries are violating LGBTQ and women's rights issues. And I care about that, like I really do, but I care about that from a Western perspective. And it doesn't work when you try to impose your views on another culture. Like it's just not going to work. So why kill the innocent people to do it? Why kill the innocent people to do it? So how are the ethics of a country formed around their culture? And I hope what you'll think about, like, as you listen to this, if you actually listen to me for this long, is what do you justify in your life that you think may be wrong somehow? And when you look at that, you're going to be thinking about it from your Western perspective if you're somebody from the West. So whatever perspective you have, whatever your cultural backing is, however you grew up, that's going to affect the way that you view these situations. And because of that, you know, people with certain traits may think a certain way, and people with other traits will think a different way. And certain people that get into certain positions will only think a certain way, or they're more so think a certain way. And that always affects like what happens. And what we have at this point is people in the U.S. government, and also, and when I say people in the U.S. government, I mean Congress people, lawmakers, the executive branch as well, and regular voters we all live in a culture that has accepted the violence that's perpetuated by the United States overseas. And that's not the only thing. There's plenty of other things related to capitalism and distribution systems and issues in inner cities in our own country, which I thought I had as part of this list, but I guess I skipped over it. But that's okay. I got to do a better job of having shorter notes, and I'm on the end anyway. So that's all for today. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, or you want to yell at me, please email me at illegitimatescholar@gmail.com, or join us on his Discord, link in the podcast description. Please come and join us. I'd really appreciate it. And that $20 is still up. All right. Thanks. Bye.